Over to you, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. I ought to say that I'm speaking from notes, and that's a discipline which I've long since left behind me. So if you think I'm rabbiting pointlessly, please don't hesitate to tell me to get on with it. I want to see if I can get this off my screen about the recording. Yes, I've done that. I was a bit surprised when Federico suggested that I might talk about the Blackwell history of the world, but a moment's thought showed me that he was quite right, as of course he always is, in seeing that the story might tell us something more broadly about the way in which we think about world history and writing world history has changed over the last 30 years or so. The Blackwell history was conceived and designed in the first instance in the late 1980s. And if you look now at the list of titles of the series, your first thought would probably be, if I were editing a multi-volume history of the world, I wouldn't do it like this. And that itself is a reflection of the time at which it was conceived and the way in which things have changed since then. Most painfully, obviously, although perhaps not quite so painfully obviously as I feared when I look at those who are present, is the complete absence of women from the list of authors. And that clearly reflects, in the first place, the fact that in the 1990s, when most of the initial commissioning was done, there were still extremely few women well established in relatively senior roles in history departments in the English-speaking world. But we did become concerned about that quite quickly in the 21st century. And if women had accepted all the invitations that they've had, they would actually make up about a third, roughly, of the list of authors. And I'm particularly sorry that there are no women here who might help us to consider later why that might be, which seems to me a real puzzle. But leaving that aside, going on to the rest, when John Davy of Blackwell, whom some of you may well have known or worked with, a very great publisher and a very great man, he and I dreamt up this series in the late 1980s. That is to say, before two transformations had taken place, which have clearly been embodied in and impacted on this story. The first, and the one that I shall concentrate on for the moment at least, intellectually and academically, is how we define and perceive world history and what place it has as a field and as a discipline and our understanding of what we're doing. But the second, which is actually closely linked with it and has become increasingly acute, is the transformation in publishing and the distinction between educational and trade publishing, which has become dramatically wider and sharper since the beginning of the century. Before that, we used to, different categories, we used to talk about academic and general, and assumed a large area of overlap between the two. That is to say that a very large proportion of historical writing was intended both for use in higher education and for a wide general readership. And it was in that kind of publishing that John Davy particularly excelled, and for which the series was designed, which was reflected in our first mission statement, which included the statement that our goal was to provide an accessible source of knowledge about the entire human past for every curious person in every part of the world. Let me say a little more about the context of world history, which in the 1980s, as an academic discipline, barely existed. People still thought of history in those days as the history as national history, and it's the history of Europe and European expansion and the societies which it created. I found a note while I was thinking about this that I made in 1980 at a faculty meeting in Sheffield, when I heard the then professor of modern history paying a tribute to his predecessor, who had just died and who had successively held the titles both of professor of medieval history and professor of modern history. And what I heard about him was this. As professor of medieval history, he taught medieval European history and medieval English history. Before that, as professor of modern history, he not only taught modern European history and modern English history, but also, in an emergency, took over the course in imperial and American history. Therefore, he taught the whole of history. And that in 1980s was, I think it was said slightly tongue-in-the-cheek, but it was an accurate statement of what history as an academic field and discipline was supposed to mean, not only in the English-speaking world, but I think just as clearly in continental Europe and indeed in much of the rest of the world as well. Curricula everywhere meant national history plus bits of European or United States or imperial history, which were thought to provide a context for the national history in question, and then usually something that was supposed to be a bit of the Western intellectual tradition. In the UK, that often meant the history of political thought. In the United States, Western civilization. There were very few departments in the UK, apart from SOAS, which had specialists in parts of the world that had not been colonized or in the pre-colonial history of those that had. And the rest of Europe was no better. Slightly better in the United States. Certainly there were a lot more people working in such areas, but they tended to be seen not entirely inaccurately as outposts of the State Department or the CIA. And even when they were to be found in history departments, they weren't really part of them. I was greatly disappointed when I went as a visitor to Chicago, at the University of Chicago in 1989, which, among other reasons for being excited about, I was looking forward to hugely because it had been one of the places where world historical thinking had been pioneered. W.H. McNeill and Marshall Hodgson, for example, had both taught in that department within quite recent memory. And indeed, when I looked at the list of my new colleagues, it was remarkably impressive, absolutely star-studded, brilliant people in the history of pretty much any part of the world one could think of. But then I found from day to day that actually they didn't talk to each other. They were just a bunch of specialists. They didn't talk to each other or to the American historians or the European historians. So it didn't really amount to anything or have anything which could be considered as world history, as distinct from a bunch of extremely distinguished local histories. I should say that the University of Chicago has turned back onto the right path again in recent years and has a number of people now who do look at things in the way that I would have hoped to find then. And among historians in general, at that time, it was still the case that the idea of world history was widely distrusted, a concept associated with people like Spengler and Toynbee. It had begun to emerge as a historical discipline only very tentatively in the 1960s, with the work of William McNeill, for example, or in the United Kingdom in the 70s with John Roberts. And there were one or two others. Geoffrey Barraclough argued powerfully, persuasively for world history, but for reasons of personality, I think he had very little impact. Much more important and general was the influence of the Annales school, and particularly of Brodel, which never proclaimed itself a champion of world history, but with the breadth of vision that it had, did a great deal, I think, to begin to alert people to, nevertheless, to the existence of a world beyond the one in which their own work was placed. Apart from those few people, those who contributed influentially to the broadening of historians' horizons from the 1970s onwards were not trained historians. That, of course, has always been the case, hasn't it, of people who have advanced history as a discipline. But I'm thinking, for example, of Emanuel Wallerstein, Edward Said, Eric Wolf, Jack Goody. Those people, since the 1970s, had begun to question our horizons and our approaches in ways that were starting to be taken notice of, particularly, obviously, with the publication of Said's Orientalism in 1978, and with somewhat less publicity, but probably more influence, Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History in 1982. The first course in world history to be taught, it's certainly in this country, I think I'm prepared to say, anywhere, which wasn't just about the very recent past, was launched in Sheffield in 1985. It was called, and so chronologically it was not complete, we called it World Civilizations from 600 to 1900. And we required all single honors history students to take it as a compulsory course. But at that time, there was still no agreed basis on which such a course could be taught. Certainly no texts remotely corresponding to its context, and really very little in the way of general reading. Finding stuff for students to read was really very difficult. That was one of the things that made putting on such a course very exciting, and of course in the eyes of some of my colleagues, very foolhardy. For that sort of reason, and a general increase in comment and thinking around the world, it seemed to me in the 1980s that world history was at roughly the state that history itself as a discipline had been 100 years or rather more before. And that was one of the things which had been a great time for the launching of book series and journals and the other paraphernalia of emerging academic disciplines. And that was one of the Journal of World History, incidentally, began to be published in 1990. That was one of the things that suggested to me that a series of books which amounted to a substantial account of world history was something that we needed. And one of the things that helped me to sell the idea to John Davey, I ought to say very hastily, it didn't take a lot of selling. John was immensely enthusiastic and wonderfully creative and supportive. So that's the context in which we set up the series, and in which it began to be designed to produce the list, or the first version of the list that I've circulated. The first question, of course, and I'm sorry, I'm not. here we are. I found the bit I was looking for. The first thing that we had to decide, of course, was what the format should be. And ideally, I would have liked to be able to propose a history chronologically constructed and in slices, as it were. But that was absolutely unthinkable. There simply were not people about at that time who could even begin to think of doing that for most of the past. And that is the reason why the essential structure of the series is one of regional volumes, each of which begins at the beginning, and the authors are asked to bring it up to somewhere in the 20th century. Most of them, in fact, have brought it, of those that have been written so far, have come up to the present. And at that first stage, I thought the best that we could do by way of chronological definition was to have a volume at the beginning on early man, the beginnings of humanity and so on, and one at the end on the 20th century, or the world on the verge of the 21st century, something of that kind. I'll come back to that in a moment. What I did try to do to avoid stereotypes and to avoid being confined by conventional thinking was to define the regions in a way that wasn't simply a reflection of current political geography and current historiography. And so, for instance, I tried to do that basically by breaking up regions which had conventionally been treated as one. So I didn't want one single volume on Europe. I wanted to regionalize Europe and eventually the Mediterranean as well. On the other hand, to unite regions which had previously not been thought of within a single frame, which is why I wanted a volume on North America, and still do. That has been a complete and absolute headache. But why I wanted a single volume on Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. And the first 3 or 4 people I approached about that all said, you can't possibly do that. These are all highly specialized regions. Nobody could deal with them all. And of course, as editor of a series like this, that was the best, clearest possible indication I had that I had invited somebody whom I shouldn't have invited. If that was how they saw things. The great success of that approach, I think, has been the 2 volumes which David Christian has written on Russia, Central Asia, and Mongolia. That was David's idea, not mine. I asked him just to write a history of Russia, but he said yes, he would do that if it could be Central Asia and Mongolia as well. And then a couple of years later, he came back and said, I'm awfully sorry, but would you mind if I turned this into 2 volumes, which he has done. And they divide at 1250, which shows a very proper, in my view, a very proper chronological balance. And I think they are it's a terrific achievement. And historiographically, it seems to me extremely interesting. In retrospect, I can look back and say I might have carried that approach through a bit more determinedly. I wonder, for instance, whether I need have taken it for granted that there should be a single volume on China, accepting in effect the grand historical narrative of the first emperor, and a single volume on India, although which was the original intention. Now that has been supplemented because instead of having the volume on the Islamic world, which was on my first list, there are now to be 2 volumes, one on the Middle East and one on the Indo-Muslim world, which will embrace, of course, the subcontinent and South Asia. And I regard that as a considerable improvement on the initial thinking. The other big change, a bigger change, which has come about since we made that first list, is that it has become possible to have chronologically defined volumes. It came up first, I guess, towards the end of the 90s, when I had thought from the outset that it might be possible to find someone who would write a single volume on industrialization and since the middle of the 18th century. And when I approached Chris Bailey, he embraced the idea with great enthusiasm and wrote what many of you will know, a very great book, The Birth of the Modern World, and later, just before he died, its sequel, The Remaking of the Modern World. So that meant that we had, with Chris on board, we had genuinely world history from 1750 onwards. And then I found that Sanjay Subramaniam could be persuaded to do something similar, or at least I hope he's been persuaded to do something similar for the early modern world. And at that point, it became sensible, since Peter Bang was on board, or was he? At any rate, he was the possibility of a volume on the late ancient world was certainly on the horizon, and it seemed sensible to fill that in and make the chronological sequence continuous. And I think that is a real indication of the way in which the practice of world history has improved very greatly over a space of a couple of decades. So that now on the list you have before you, the chronological volumes are presented as the lead volumes with the regional ones in support, which reverses how we set them out at first. Well, I'm so sorry. My printer printed these notes on two sides, and that has made me completely confused about where everything is. Okay. A final reflection before I move on to another thing is whether, if it had been possible to do the series only in chronological volumes from the outset, I would have done so. I might have done, but if I had, I think it would have been a mistake. I think we do need the regional volumes to give body and weight. And being myself in the throes of writing a chronological one, I'm very conscious of that, because with the best will in the world, if one's dealing with a perspective of, or trying to keep in one's mind and discussion an entire scene which stretches from North Africa to Japan, it's impossible to do that and at the same time offer really substantial discussion of most of what's in between at any given moment. Well, as it's worked out, I think we've been both successful and unsuccessful. The most obvious thing that you'll see, and it's inherent, isn't it, even in the title of this talk, is how long it has taken. We've now been at it for 30 years, and the series is still only half complete. It isn't even completely commissioned, although I should mention that a number of volumes have been commissioned at other times and slipped out again. And the reason for that is the one that is really perfectionism. John and I did decide right from the beginning that we wanted really very, very good people. We wanted people who had major contribution and who had a great deal to say. And people like that are not necessarily available at the drop of a hat to write a book when you ask them to, even if they like the idea. So that, for instance, Tony Reid, who's written our volume on Southeast Asia, which is one of the very best, it really is a terrific book. When I asked him if he would consider it, he said yes, but he had 3 major projects on hand. And they were all 3 very major. And we said, okay, we'll wait. And 20 years later, we got our book. That isn't the obvious way to do something commercially, which I might have to come back to, or you might want me to come back to. And it's also meant something which I didn't foresee, that in one sense, as a series, we failed in the sense that as a series, we haven't really made a statement of where world history is in its time, and probably as a series been much less influential than it might have been if it had been completed, say, by 2005, which was our original target date. On the other hand, we're not actually doing as badly as that suggests in this respect, for a different reason, because while we haven't made anything like a complete statement of what world history is now, neither has anybody else. There has been, as you all know, of course, an immense amount of activity and enrichment in every part of the field over the last 20, 25 years. But what there hasn't been, in my view, is anything approaching seriously successful synthesis. We've got a little bit further. If we circulated colleagues in a dozen departments now and asked them to jot down what they regarded as the main chronological divisions of world history, we'd probably get something approaching a consensus, which would not have been the case 30 years ago. But nevertheless, it does seem to me that the field is still immensely fragmented. And if anything, the proliferation of specialized work, which much of which is of wonderful quality. Again, it seems to me there has been a great improvement in that respect over anything that was, well, almost anything that was to be seen 20 years ago. But we don't have synthesis. And that has made one quality of this series, I think, more important now than it was when we began, and that is the fact that these books are written by individuals and by distinguished individuals, serious historical thinkers. I think that's, at the time, we simply took that for granted. It looked the obvious thing to do. But it seems to me now that it means we're offering something in a world of handbooks and encyclopedias and collective works and Wikipedia and the rest, which isn't to be found very much in other places. If I'm wrong about that, please tell me so. But I now think that's one of the most important things that we're doing. As to the future, I can't say a great deal. I will say very briefly something on which I'd be happy to enlarge if you want me to, which is the question of the change which has taken place in publishing. It has impacted very much on this series, because towards the end of the century, or about the end of the century, Blackwell's made a decision to specialize in educational, which effectively meant textbook publishing. And that meant more or less jettisoning the kind of thing that John Davey had done over the previous 2 decades to turn them into a major publisher. Davey left the firm for that reason. And I thought at the time, and I wish now that I'd tried to carry it through, that perhaps I ought to see if I could take the series to a different publisher. It didn't happen. It stayed with Blackwell's, who in 2007 were taken over by the Wiley Corporation, and by 2017 completely absorbed into it. And that has meant an increasing tension throughout that period between what I've been describing to you as what our series was doing and what textbook publishers increasingly fixated on exclusively on the textbook market wanted. That has been a continuous problem, and one which, among other things, meant that when a number of volumes, including some of those that would have been dealing with the ancient world, dropped out for one reason or another, I have not been allowed to replace them. So that in that respect, although in some other respects the series has been improved, but in that respect it's been greatly impoverished. That is and continues to be a growing problem, not because the publishers haven't done their best, or at any rate the people who've been dealing with me have done their best to stay with the original spirit, but it has become more and more uncomfortable in relation to their business model, to the point where it has seemed to me that there is now an absolute contradiction in that their business, that what they are concerned to do is to provide books which can be prescribed to students as course texts. And that almost by definition means books that aren't saying anything new. What this series is meant to do is set up the courses of the future. So that's a problem, and it's going to go on being a problem, I think, over coming years. And I'm sure it's not a problem which relates only to my series. The other thing, of course, that has changed dramatically and makes a huge difference to authors is that now, if you want to work, to write, to do your own stuff, you have to find somebody to pay for your time to do it. That wasn't true in the academic world in which this series was conceived, and it has certainly meant that a number of people with whom I've discussed projects in the last few years have had to say, sorry, can't do it because I can't get funding to buy the time to do it in. That again is obviously going to be a growing problem. And to return to where I started, it's certainly not one that's going to help with the gender balance. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Bob.